Today's political battles will eventually come to an end. And in the coming years, young people will become adults and they will take over. We can get a glimpse of what the future will look like based on the next generation. It's kind of obvious, right? Somebody who's 15 years old in 15 years will be in charge of many big companies. Some of them will even be in politics. But I can tell you one thing. There's a debate over whether or not the future will be conservative or liberal. And one of the things I've said very often is, I think it's going to be pretty conservative. And this story going around is exactly why. This is from outsideonline.com, and it reads, I got a vasectomy because of climate change. Getting one was by far the most powerful personal action I could take for our planet. And I want to contrast for you two stories. This is from a leftist who's concerned that CO2 emissions are destroying the planet. Therefore, why would you want to have a child to bring them into this world with all the wildfires and disasters and overpopulation, at the same time contributing to that problem while subjecting a new life to it? That's how the left views things. Let me show you a story from the right. I don't have 7 arms to hug them all. A year after their father's death in Afghanistan, a mother and her children struggle to move on. This is from time.com, and it's from October 10th, 2019. I feel for this woman's family. She lost her husband in war and the father of her children. It's a sad story. Now, they live in Utah. Utah is a red state. I'm not saying they're overtly conservative, but in this red state, this family had 7 children. Compare those numbers. And I think you can see where I'm getting with this. A story that I covered on my second channel not a few weeks ago, I believe. Republicans have more kids than Democrats, a lot more kids. Red states have more kids than blue states. Maybe that's why Republicans keep winning. It's hard to know exactly what's going to happen because along with the decline in liberals having children, you have an increase in immigration. So here's what I'm going to do. First thing I want to do is I want to read for you this story and comment on it about why this individual got a vasectomy because of climate change. Before we get started, however, head over to timcast.com/donate if you'd like to support my work. There are multiple ways you can support what I'm doing, but the best thing you can do is share this video, which you may have realized by now is not about impeachment, because I said, you know what, enough. We deserve a break. And there are other important issues that I could focus on for the main segment I do every day. But let's, so again, helping my channel grow, just share this content. It really does help. Let's read the story outside from Wes Seiler, who I'm assuming is the person who got the vasectomy. He says, I've always struggled to combine the idea of personal responsibility with the overwhelming need for human society to address the threat posed by climate change. Since at least the 1970s, the massive energy corporations responsible for the vast majority of our carbon emissions have known about and done nothing to mitigate the harm they cause. Full stop. Actually, in the 70s, there was a big concern over global cooling, where they actually encouraged people to use more fossil fuels. But yes, there was a concern over global warming, which has persisted to this date. Because they own politicians worldwide, there doesn't appear to be any will to take government level action. But I'm supposed to turn off a light? What possible impact could that ever have? And why is this all on my shoulders and not theirs? Well, because the world is comprised of individuals. Individual actions results in the bigger picture. The snowflake doesn't blame itself for the avalanche, but you can't tell a corporation just to stop. That doesn't make sense. We need fossil fuels for food production and food transport, and we have a lot of problems with waste in this world. And I agree we could do more to solve. I'm very much in favor of protecting the environment, weaning off fossil fuels, and solving that problem. But I don't see how a vasectomy actually solves anything, because let's be real. If you don't want to have kids, don't have kids. This seems like some more of an ideological extreme. Listen, if you're concerned about how you bring up kids in this world, it makes sense to say, I don't think we'll have any more. In fact, some people have said they're going to have 1 or 2, maybe just 2 kids, because then you're at population stasis. Some have said, I just want to have kids. Okay, I think it's a little bit extreme for a lot of reasons, but fine, go ahead and don't do it. In this instance, however, going for a vasectomy because you don't want to have kids is strange. Not only that, I believe this man is 38 years old and he doesn't have any kids. It sounds like he's just virtue signaling. I got to be honest. It sounds like he's saying he did this for climate change when in reality he just didn't want to have kids. I mean, you're 38. I mean, I'm 33. I don't have kids, and I guess I want to have kids. We'll see what happens. But anyway, let's read on. He says, when I got engaged to my fiance, Virginia, and I started planning for the future, it wasn't just my dog Wiley and me against the world anymore. All of a sudden, I started thinking 10 to 20 or more years ahead. Children are an obvious thing to plan. With a sudden focus on responsible decision-making, it no longer made sense to leave hypothetical future offspring up to chance. When should we have them? What did our careers look like on the timeline? Who'd be responsible for staying home and raising them? Couldn't we just have one of the dogs do that? That's a weird, okay. He says, we got engaged in June 2018, a couple months before a wildfire destroyed an entire town in California. Another one wiped out sections of Malibu. Shortly after that, most of the Mississippi River basin flooded. Something that might be the new normal, virtually eliminating the future for industrial agriculture throughout a region that produces much of this nation's food. And of course, the whole Donald Trump thing has been, oh, and there it is. The whole Donald Trump thing. Listen, natural disasters have existed forever. Did you know in the past they thought they were acts of God? Now we know it just sometimes disasters happen. I'll quote Bill Maher. In the film Religulous, someone asks him, if you reached a glass outside and started raining, wouldn't you call that a miracle? And Bill Maher says, no, sometimes it rains. Well, guess what? Sometimes there are wildfires. There have been reports that because of California mismanagement in clearing the brush from the floor of these areas, it starts fires. And wildfires are actually a natural process when, biodegradable materials start piling up or carbon-based materials, and then there's too many, fires start. My understanding, and I could be wrong about this, is that it's a cycle. There will be too much, it'll start a fire, but because we're now preventing them, it gets worse and worse and worse. I do think it's fair to say that many people are concerned climate change is causing more extreme weather phenomenon, but still, this sounds like a virtue signal. Let's read on, and then I want to get to a specific point where I can just, let me put it this way. This is extremism. This is what you get when you have hysteria and outright extremism when it comes to political ideology. This man talks about how he's trying to save the polar bears by doing this. Maybe as a joke, I guess, but the polar bears, while they're sort of in trouble, they're actually doing okay. I'll show you the data. But actually, let me read more. He says, it looks like the pace of climate change is speeding ahead of science's ability to understand or forecast it. Thinking about hypothetical West Jr.'s life as far into the future as I've already lived, 38 years. So he's 38 with no kids. It's tempting to try to forecast stuff like so many feet of sea level rise or the extinction of some keystone species. But that may not be possible. The future might be worse than any of us currently fear. Then Virginia and I started talking about something we could do for ourselves to make a meaningful impact on the bigger problem. We could just forego the whole kid thing altogether. Dude, you're already 38. I mean, it sounds like you were already planning on it. He then talks about how there's too many humans, and this brings me to the big point about what a waste of time. You see, many people have been talking for quite some time about not having kids to offset global warming, climate change, climate crisis, whatever you want to call it. That makes no sense. You know why? First, conservatives are certainly having kids. Religious folk are certainly having kids. India and China are certainly having kids. Now, I think based on current numbers, China's actually lower than the US, but China's massive. And there are many countries, I believe in Africa, for instance, the entire continent, the birth rate is around between like 3 and 5, depending on the country. So while you are not having kids, and you make up only a subsection of the United States, you look at other continents and other countries, and they're certainly having kids. But think about the exponential growth. You're not offsetting anything, okay? The people in certain African tribes who are having 4 or 5 kids, those 4 or 5 kids also have 4 or 5 kids. Now, it is projected to go down by 2050, but they're still going to have 2 or 3 kids, in which case your numbers are declining. Now, the reason why this is so important to consider, you are the people who care about climate change, right? Do you think China cares about climate change? They say they do, but they don't. They're building new coal power plants. This is one of the biggest ideological dead ends that the left faces. They don't want to have kids, so who will carry out your ideas to protect the environment in the future if the conservatives who don't think climate change is a big problem or don't believe in it outright are having tons of kids, maybe even 7, and you are getting abortions and actually not having kids or getting vasectomies? You see, your ideas die with your kids. The future will be handed off to the next generation, and you can try and say as much as you want, but in the end, other people share their ideas as well. Other people disagree, and they're having more kids than you. Take it for what it is. But let me show you where we ultimately end up. You know what the bigger issue is? It's not so much about whether or not other countries are having kids. It's about the fact that while you are deciding you won't have kids, people who work in industry and governments are outsourcing the positions they need to grow the economy. This results in a rather funny phenomenon. First, we have the story from June of 2018. Would you give up having children to save the planet? Meet the couples who have. The environmental toll of having even one child is enormous. 58.6 tons of carbon each year. So is going child-free the answer to our climate crisis? The answer is a resounding no. because this is very, very short-sighted. We end up seeing stories like this. Want to fight climate change? Actually, this predates that. Have fewer children. Well, The Guardian told us, these left-wing publications, you gotta have less kids. We gotta fight climate change, right? The next best actions are selling your car, avoiding flights, going vegetarian, according to a study into true impacts of different green lifestyle choices. Okay, not having kids is a great way to fight climate change. But in 30 years, who will continue that fight for climate change when the people who don't believe in it had kids and their kids are now 20 and 30 years old and they're now voting against you? You see the ideological roadblock you're facing. Perhaps the answer is have 1 or 2 kids, but they're saying outright none and get vasectomies. What do you think happens when the economy starts receding or depressing because there aren't enough people to sustain it? That brings the next story. From January of this year, Megan McArdle for the Washington Post, columnist, writes in an op-ed, "Can immigration save the U.S. from its birth rate crisis?" Man, I tell you what, there are a lot of people who certainly think there's a conspiracy behind this. No, this is dominoes falling over, and it's quite hilarious. You see, the people who believe in getting vasectomies and not having kids make up a very small faction of this country. It is true, however, that liberals, for the most part, aren't having that many kids in general. You will then have leaders of industry and government saying, we need new workers to fill these jobs. So what do? They open the doors for immigration. I am not criticizing immigration. I'm saying, to those who say don't have kids because they think it'll help offset climate change, you are wrong. Because by not having kids, they just replace you with people from other countries who are willing to do the jobs your kids aren't around to do. Now, of course, naturally, you're going to get a lot of people on the left saying, oh, the great replacement conspiracy. I'm not talking about conspiracies or race or anything like that. I don't care. I'm saying, if you think not having kids will reduce the global population, you're only reducing the ideology of the people who believe that. You get the point? Conservative families, immigrant families will keep having kids, okay? That includes people of all races. And the only people who will cease are those who actually believe what you do. In the end, we can see where this leads us. And don't worry, I want to get to the polar bears in a second. Fatherly wrote this article in March 26th of this year. Red states have more kids than blue states. Maybe that's why Republicans keep winning. But this goes back to 2006. Let me read this for you. And for those that did see the segment I did earlier, forgive me, but it's important context. Liberals are not having enough babies to keep up with conservatives. Arthur Brooks, a social scientist at Syracuse University, was the first to point this out all the way back in 2006, when he went on ABC News and blew blue starters' minds. The political right is having a lot more kids than the political left, he explained. The gap is actually 41%. Data on the U.S. birth rate from the General Social Survey confirms this trend. A random sample of 100 conservative adults will raise 208 children, more than replacing them, while 100 liberal adults will raise a mere 147 kids. That's a massive gap. They say, when we collected the number of children per capita in each state and then compared the data to statewide voting records, we found that the trend is so strong that it can even be observed at the state level. Red states come out with significantly more kids per capita than blue states. This means that today we are seeing the top end of the bell curve, and it's going to shift. When I covered this story, I showed the data from Pew that Generation Z is slightly more conservative than millennials in some key areas. Not completely. Generation Z is a little more progressive, and a little more conservative, depending. There's slightly more support for Donald Trump among Generation Z. Many people took that to believe that young people in general are more likely to be conservative. I don't think that's correct. What I think we're actually seeing is that there are just more conservatives in Gen Z than we can expect. There likely is still a trend among young people to move towards progressive politics, especially when you see the media being produced for kids. It's being produced by a lot of leftists and progressives. But because of the sheer number of conservative children going back to 2006, we knew this, you will likely see a bucking of that trend. So I've said it before, but for the context, traditionally every generation is slightly more progressive, but for the first time in like 4 or 5 generations, Gen Z has actually shifted that a little bit. So it stands to reason, with people saying they're going to get vasectomies, we are going to end up with more conservatives in the future. Now, some people have said to me, Tim, with immigration replacing these liberals, you're going to have a more liberal future. But let me just stress, The migrants who come here tend to be substantially more conservative than progressives. They're not conservatives, but they're substantially more conservative. So what I think you'll end up seeing is a shift towards the right. Whatever this left-wing rush, off a cliff is, I think in 15 more years, you're going to see a push to the right. Because I think a good point to bring up is, for instance, a lot of the Hispanic migrants who come to this country are Christians. You now see Kanye West, for instance, talking about the gospel and Christianity and religion. I think you're going to see a resurgence in Christianity because of this. Think about it. The people who are more likely to be atheist are also more likely to be pro-choice, not have kids. They're also more likely to be doing things like this. Which brings me to that great article, AOC Gets Choked Up at Climate Forum. My dreams of motherhood are now bittersweet. The future, in my opinion, will be substantially more conservative than it is today. Because the left-wing politics will end up bending towards a more conservative position as time goes on. Gen Z, although many of the Gen Z people are worse snowflakes than millennials, they're likely going to start skewing towards the right for a couple reasons. As more young people are conservative, eventually the dominant social group will be more conservative. You'll end up with kids who are big fans of PewDiePie who don't trust the weird progressive media, and then you're going to have young people wanting to be like that. If you have 4 kids who are progressive and 6 who are conservative, the new kid who steps in is going to want to be popular, and the most popular person has the most amount of support. So they're going to shift in that direction. But this idea of getting a vasectomy and not having kids, yeah, it's pervasive. AOC is saying her dreams of motherhood are now bittersweet. She can't do it. Imagine what life is like if you don't believe climate change is that big of a deal. I think it's a big deal too, but I also realize if you don't have kids, your ideas go away when you do. Well, they're not having kids. But here's my favorite part. I told you I'd get to the polar bears, and I got to get to the polar bears. So he says in the op-ed, we're not having kids. I found a colleague's brother here in Bozeman who performs vasectomies and made an appointment. I was afraid of getting my scrotum operated on, but the procedure ended up being quicker and less invasive than most dental appointments. He goes on to explain that he took Valium before the surgery, and for the next 7 days, it felt like someone kicked him hard where the sun don't shine. Doesn't sound like it felt very good at all, and that's 7 days. Ooh, I'll give you respect for enduring that because that's bravo, right? That's gotta hurt, right? I think even if you disagree politically, there is still going to be the brotherhood of understanding the pain of getting kicked and dealing with that for 7 days. Sure. While I disagree with you politically, I'll give you respect there. He says the worst part was taking a week off from the gym. I'd been making good progress. It's just a week, it's a good recovery. Just don't go overboard. Eat some protein. Now here's the best part. It might not be enough to save the polar bear, and it might not prevent the next campfire, but this is the absolute biggest difference we can make. We need fewer humans, and getting there voluntarily will be an awful lot less painful than doing it with war, famine, and natural disaster. And I agree with that final message to an extent. We do need less humans, but we need less humans in major cities. We need less, we actually need more humans working on certain areas of technology. The big problem we have is that we have too many humans who do literally nothing. So here's the challenge, man. The world would be better off if people were more in line with how the United States is focusing on the problem. Developing new technologies, people like you, Wes, who want to do something about climate change. But you look at China, they don't agree. And they're producing, I believe, around double what we produce. Now, it is true, at least according to my understanding, that per capita, we produce the most. But China as a nation is producing around double the carbon we do, and they are still building coal power plants. What do you do to solve that problem? This is not it. So you know what? In the end, guess who wins? The conservatives. Because the very last thing I'll give you is the polar bears. He says he wants to save them. Well, I decided to go to the Arctic World Wildlife Foundation's website to figure out what exactly is happening with the polar bears and is there any cause for concern. And the reality is a little bit, but maybe not so much. You see, they say this. Before 1973, several polar bear populations were decimated by unsustainable hunting by European, Russian, and American hunters and trappers from the 1600s right through the mid-1970s. In 1973, Canada, the US, Denmark, Norway, and former USSR signed the International Agreement on the Conservation of Polar Bears and Their Habitat. In 2005, the polar bear was upgraded from least concern to vulnerable by the IUCN group. In 2013, ministers and other leaders from 5 polar bear range states met in Moscow for the first international forum on polar bear conservation. The leaders made significant commitments to address the issues of polar bear habitat, research, and trade. The event was supported by the WWF. Today, polar bears are among the few large carnivores that are still found in roughly their original habitat and range, and in some places, in roughly their natural numbers. Although most of the world's 19 populations have returned to healthy numbers, there are differences between them. Some are stable, some seem to be increasing, and some are decreasing due to various pressures. 4 populations are declining, 2 are increasing, 5 are stable, and 8 are data deficient. In the future, they do fear that there will be a 30% or so decline. So I'll tell you what, when it comes to the left, you know the big problem is? They don't know where to stop. They don't know how far is too far. And Jordan Peterson has talked about this. Conservatives know how far is too far and have no problem calling it out. In fact, there's a big fight among conservatives right now about people showing up to like Donald Trump Jr.'s events. I'm not going to get into it. The left doesn't know when to stop. They don't know what the right amount of money should be to pay somebody. They say $15 an hour, and then as soon as they get that, they say $20 an hour. They don't know at what point you stop fighting. You see, your efforts to save the polar bear worked. Now what you need to do is say, okay, where we're at right now is helping the polar bears. What can we do to think ahead to make sure we can help them in the future? Getting a vasectomy and not having kids is the opposite of that, because there will be no one that you can instill your ideas into in the future to make sure the polar bears remain protected. So by getting a vasectomy, AOC, by crying and saying you can't have kids, and to all the other progressives who for various reasons are terminating their pregnancies, refusing to have children, or outright preventing the ability to even have the kids in the first place, your ideas will go away with you. The polar bears are going to be okay. However, with you gone, and with no children to share your ideas, there will be no one left to protect those polar bears. But alas, I believe that what I'm saying will fall on deaf ears, because they'd rather virtue signal. Let me just give you one final thought. I hope you enjoyed this, because we're getting away from impeachment, at least for a little bit. But this gentleman here was 38 when he decided to do this. Dude, I think you're already not going to have kids. And I'll say it again. You don't have to have a vasectomy to avoid having kids. You can just choose not to do it. And then maybe in the future, I guess it's reversible anyway, but just goes to show you that what we're seeing here, in my opinion, is ideological extremism, which is a dead end and results in the loss of this culture and these ideas. I'm sure some people on the right are cheering and laughing about it. But it's virtue signaling, saying, look what I did to prove that I care. AOC, you cried, well, I went and did the right thing. Well, guess what? They're going to bring in more immigrants because you won't have kids, and those immigrants are going to have kids. And in other countries and continents, they're still having kids. So you are quite literally doing nothing but removing the only people who seek to help solve the problem of climate change. I think it's fair to say in the future, no one will care. Unless something really bad happens and everyone's forced to, but I don't see it. The problem is too big to be perceived by an individual, in which case most people will just say, you know what, sometimes it rains. I'll leave it there. Stick around. Next segment's coming up at 6 p.m., youtube.com/TimCastNews. Thanks for hanging out. I will see you all there.